On page 9 of Marti's pattern, Marti describes how to make the Dresden Plate petals. It's really a lot simpler than what it looks like when you actually look at the pattern. You'll begin with the template shape, and you'll fold it in half the long side of the petal. And you'll chain piece it through your machine with that widest end first, going towards the fold. You can see here I've chain pieced 16. That's all the petals in my Dresden Plate. Once you've chain pieced them, you snip them apart. You'll use your scissors to cut a diagonal edge there, and then you'll turn your Dresden Plate out, and it's just that simple. See how easy that was to make that Dresden Plate unit. Do that for all 144 pieces. Once you've turned your block unit, you're going to press it with that seam in the center. If you have a hard time knowing what the center is, finger press your unit first and then just match the center seam up with what the area is that you finger pressed. Do that for all 144 petals. When stitching across the edge of the tiny petals, you're going to use a 12 stitches per inch or smaller seam. That way you have a nice solid seam there for that part that you turn under. If you're having trouble getting the point in your petals, use an awl, a purple thing, or a stiletto to make that point nice and crisp. You'll continue to follow the instructions on page 9 of Marti's pattern, stitching 2 of the petals together. You'll begin at the folded section at the top, working towards the small section at the bottom. These can be chain pieced, but you're going to want to follow Marti's instructions and backstitch at least one backstitch at the beginning. That way it'll make it easier for when you turn. Go ahead and do that for all of your pairs. Once you've put your set of 2 together, press your seam open and then connect it to another set of 2. Press that seam open, connect that to another set of 4. You're always going to want to press your seams open before you connect your next set because you don't have a lot of room at the bottom to put those sets together. Once you have all 16 petals stitched together and pressed, you'll finish your final seams to make it into the Dresden Plate. Don't worry if it doesn't lay perfectly flat. This is where a little squirt of water or Mary Ellen's Best Press will help even that little block up. Leave the opening. We'll go over that later with what we do with that opening. Go ahead and complete all 9 of your Dresden Plates. The background blocks for the Dresden Plate will be unfinished 6.5 inches. Marti's pattern on page 12 tells us to cut our background block about 1 inch larger. We cut these 7.5 inches to allow us some wiggle room once we set the block. There's a variety of ways you can set the Dresden Plate block. Marti indicates in her pattern that she set the block and then she's stitched around the edge with the monofilament threads, leaving these flaps open. I plan to blanket stitch my points to my Dresden Plate, so I will spray baste the plate to the block in what appears to be approximately the center. Once I have done that, I'm going to applique the center of the block, and once I finish appliquing the center of the block, then I'll cut the block down to 6.5 inches. To make the center circle for the Dresden Plate blocks, you'll need a piece of interfacing. We chose fusible interfacing, and you'll need the circle that's on page 38 of Marti's pattern. Take the interfacing and on the non-fusible side, use a pen and mark around the circle. Again, I'm marking it on the side that is not fusible. You'll need to make 9 circles for the 9 blocks. To complete your circles, place your interfacing with the fusible side facing the right side of your fabric. Stitch around the drawn circle directly on the line. Make sure you use an open-toed foot so you can see where you're going. Once you've done that, take a sharp pair of scissors and trim around the circle around approximately 1/4 inch from all edges. I have blanket stitched around my petals and around the center circle. Before we move on to the next step, we need to square up the block. The block needs to be a 6.5 inch block. I'm using Marti's 6.5 inch square. Let's get ready to cut our background pieces. We're going to begin by squaring up our background fabric so we have a nice straight edge to begin with. We'll square it up the same way we always do, using our roller cutter and our ruler. Once you have a squared up edge, you'll use your template set A1, the square. It's a 3.5 inch unfinished square, and you'll use that to make your cuts. You'll need 7 strips for the background and the cornerstone of the Dresden Plate blocks. You'll need 7 strips, so go ahead and cut those strips now. Once you have your 7 strips cut, go ahead and layer 3 strips on top of each other so you're cutting through 6 pieces of fabric at one time. Square up the selvage edge. And then use your A1 square from your template set A to make your cuts. Since you're cutting through 6 layers of fabric, you'll need to make 6 cuts at 6 layers each for your 36 cornerstones. Once you've made those cuts, then you can engineer your corners. To engineer your corners, go ahead and leave your squares stacked in piles of 6. Place your template number 1 from set A on top of the pile and just rock those corners with your rotary cutter. Again, I'm using an old mat, which makes it really easy to turn the mat so I can get to those other corners. Do that for all 36 of your squares. Now it's time to cut the flying geese background units. There are 2 methods for cutting those units. One using set A template 2 and one using a flying geese ruler. I'm going to demonstrate both methods. But first you have to begin by squaring up your strips. I'm cutting through 2 strips at a time so I can cut through 4 layers of fabric at a time. Square up one end and then we'll get started making those flying geese. One of the methods that Marti describes in her pattern is to use her template set A2. You begin by laying the A2 instrument on the strip that you've cut, and you'll notice that I have it lined up with the squared edge that I just squared. You make that cut and set your scrap aside. Then you turn your template over, and now it lines up with the straight edge of the strip, the diagonal edge here of the part that you just cut, and the straight edge of the top of the strip. It's best if you can work on both sides of your cutting mat when using the A2 block. You make the cut, pull your fabric aside, and then engineer your corners. That's one method. I find that method a little more time consuming, so I like to use the second method that Marti describes in her pattern, which is to use the flying geese ruler, where you simply line up the 3.5 inch edge with your strip. Make your cut, flip it over, make a second cut, and continue on. You can engineer those corners after you have all of your cuts made using either the flying geese ruler or you can use the A2 template. Either way, you can use the point of that 45-degree angle to make that cut. You're going to need a total of 36 flying geese units to finish your blocks. For the star points of the blocks, you will use 9 different fabrics and you'll need 8 A2 blocks for each. Begin by squaring up one side of your fabric. You'll actually be able to use the A1 square to cut your width for your fabric strips because it is the same width as the A2 half square, which is the unit you'll be cutting. You'll need 8 half squares of each fabric for the 9 different blocks, a total of 72 half squares. To cut your half squares, turn your fabrics around to the side, straighten the edge of one corner, and then you'll lay your A2 half square matching both right angles and make your cuts. Set the blocks aside. I'm going through 5 layers of fabric right there. Set the blocks aside to engineer your corners later. Turn the A2 around. You're going to match the straight edge on the top and the straight edge on the bottom of the template. Continue until you have 8 of each fabric. Once you have all 8 of your units cut, go ahead and engineer the corners of each unit using your A2 template. Again, I like to use the smaller mat because it's easier for me to rotate it around. Constructing the flying geese units for around the Dresden plate block is fairly simple. You'll begin with your background fabric and you'll place your half square directly on it, matching your engineered corners. Stitch along the long side of that seam. Notice you have a right angle right here. Once you've stitched that seam, it looks just like this. To set your seam, when you press it, you first set the iron on the seam here, then flip it open and press it to the outside. So then you'll have a unit that looks like this. With that unit then, you will take another half square, set it on, again matching your engineered corners, stitch that edge, set the seam with your iron, press to the outside, and your flying geese unit is ready. You'll make 4 flying geese units for each Dresden plate block. This is the block when it's finished. As you can see, it's pretty simple piecing. You just follow the instructions on page 18 and 19 for completing your blocks, your sashing, your cornerstones, and your borders. I hope you've enjoyed our exploration of From Marti and Me's Dresden Delights. Please join us again next month with our Marti and Me Club.